Hello and welcome, fellow bookworms and film fans. Welcome to this week's episode of The Contented Narrative, where we will be discussing The Green Mile by Stephen King. Now, before we get on to The Green Mile, just a few little things. So, as you're well aware, I do film these episodes in advance. So, if anybody would like to follow me on Instagram under The Contented Narrative, or join my Facebook group, The Contented Narrative, either one, we have discussions on there about book to film adaptations upcoming. And also, if you want to be a guest star when things start opening up again, please again join the Facebook group or follow me on Instagram and let me know. Then I can kind of add you to the diary there. So let's get back to this week's episode. So this week's episode, as you said, is The Green Mile. It is written by Stephen King. Now, the book was published in 1996, and it was originally a serial novel. So it was sort of like part 1, part 2, part 3. But it was then adapted to screen in 1999. Now, as usual, I will be discussing 3 things. How good is the book? How good is the film? And of course, how well does the plot take from the book? Now, the film. Oh, this film. So, it is a little bit on the longer side. It is sort of like a 3-hour film. So, for people that maybe have short attention spans, watch it in 2 halves. But it is worth watching. It is such a good book, and it's a journey as well into the souls of man, essentially, because the whole film is set on death row, which is known as the Green Mile, in this prison, and you've got the guards and you've got the prisoners, but then they kind of get like turned around on their head, and like you've got this prisoner that comes in. It's this big intimidating guy, and he turns out to be like the kindest person. But what he's accused of and, sentenced for is, you just sat there in shock. The compassion and the composure as well that John Coffey shows while waiting to die is just heartbreaking. And he's just such a genuinely nice fellow. And you see as well from the guard's point of view that they get taken in by it. They do, and they realise that actually this guy might not be, as bad as he is. And at one point they even break him out of prison to save someone's life, and then break him back into prison. Even give him the option of, do you want us to let you break out? Do you want us to let you get away with it? And it's just such a nice feeling. It's so sweet to watch, and it will break your heart. The final chapter, the ending, will completely break your heart. I'm not even, honestly, this film, it's perfectly sculpted. It really is. And it really has you wanting to know how it ends as well. I find sometimes with films, especially on the longer side, sometimes feel like they're adding things for filler. This film doesn't feel like this. This film feels like a natural progression. And it leaves me wanting to know, but does he get, how does it end? And then when you get the ending, you don't want the ending that you've got. And it's brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. It gets a 9 out of 10 for me. It really does. I would recommend this film. Watch this film. Honestly, Tom Hanks is just phenomenal in it. But it's Tom Hanks. You can't argue with that. So the book. Now, Stephen King is, of course, a very prolific writer. I don't know, obviously you can't see properly behind me, but I've got pretty much 3 shelves filled with his books there, and I've still not got all of them. He normally is known for his horror and his thrillers, and he's sort of like, he goes into supernatural tendencies as well, but this book is not like that. It's so human, this book. Like, the feelings are human, the reactions are human, what goes on between them is human. Obviously, there is a slight supernatural element, because John Coffey has a bit of the shine. Now, anyone who's read any Stephen King knows that this is a common occurrence with a lot of his characters. So you've got Firestarter, you've got The Shining, obviously. You've got, obviously, Dr. Sleep, you've got The Institute, you've got, well, pretty much loads of his books. I'm not going to list them off, but a character has what's known as the shine, and it's sort of like a special gift that sets them above everybody else. And it lets them sort of like communicate or know things that they won't necessarily know. So you've still got John Coffey with, with The Shine, which is like a little bit of a supernatural element. But it doesn't take from the story. It's not the story. The story is not about his supernatural ability as such. The story is more about these human emotions and people coming to terms with death, and people learning that what is right and what wrong is wrong, but sometimes they get turned on their head. And honestly, it's such an interesting look at the whole idea of death row. And obviously, there's a lot of people that call for the, you know, if someone's committed a heinous crime, they deserve to die, blah, blah, blah. But what if it wasn't them? What if they were wrongfully convicted, sorry. And so if they were, and you've killed them, that's it. You can't take it back. And there was a book actually I read a while back now, and I think it's called The Ripper Secret. I think it was The Ripper Secret. And this guy is wrongfully convicted of the crime, and because of that, and he gets killed, more murders are happening afterwards. It's really good. I'll have to find it, and I'll tell you in the next episode, because I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's this idea of, like, with death row, that is basically final. I mean, it's not nowadays, but it was back then. Once you're on death row, you're on death row. The only way out is death. So it looks at the effects that it has on people as well, on guards and on convicts. And it's one of Stephen King's better works. It really is. Honestly, I will read it again. It's not too much of a tome, unlike some of his books, which again, I'll read, but, you know, a bit daunting. And it's just a nice... I was racing to get to the end. Well, not racing, that's not the right word, but I was trying to get to the end. And I couldn't put it down, and I was constantly like, oh, what's the next chapter? Like, what's it going to be? And it's just such a lovely book. So honestly, this one again, this one will get an 8 out of 10 from me. It is a very good book, very good read. So now we're going to have a look at the plot. So the plot. So the film starts with Paul, who is the main guard, as an old man having a breakdown and telling his friend all about it in a old people's home in the year 1935 at the Green Mile. So when he tells her about it, he goes back to the year 1935. The book starts with Paul telling us about the Green Mile as he reminisces about it, and the year that he reminisces about is 1932, because he kind of covers a longer period of time in the reminiscence. It does also, throughout the book, it does also jump between his memories and him currently in the old people's home. Now, the reason it did this is the film kind of started it and ended it with him in the old people's home. The book started and ended each section with him in the old people's home, so it makes sense that's what they did in the book, so that's what they kind of did in the film, because as I said, it was a serialized novel at first and not a full novel. So anyways, in both, Paul has a urinary tract infection, and he's finding it hard to relieve himself, shall we say, when John Coffey comes to death row. So he's suffering with this sort of like infection when John Coffey does join him in death row. So Percy, who is a very detestable character, brings in John Coffey, shouting "Dead man walking" while he brings him in. He only has the job because he knows people, as he keeps saying, but that doesn't help him. You'll be happy to know. So in both, as Percy's brought him in, you know, Paul's going to do the welcoming to John Coffey, but realises that Percy's attitude sucks, so sends him on his way, which obviously upsets Percy, and it will come back to sort of bite him on the arse. But in both, John Coffey is a gargantuan black man who seems almost very simple in his attitude and his way towards life and the way that he speaks, but it seems very sort of like, he's a very impressive looking man, but he's also very, like, there's a line where he's just like, you know, can you leave the lights on because I don't like the dark, and it's so sweet. Now there is a French guy. We all know my French ain't great, so I think his name is Delacroix. I'm going to call him Delacroix. I'm 99% sure I can hear people shouting at their screens as they watch this video, being like, "It's this!" And I'm pretty sure if my husband was here, he would laugh at my face. In fact, I will be doing Les Mis a little bit down the line, and that is a French novel, so wish me luck with the pronunciations in that one. So anyway, so in the book, Delacroix has a tame mouse already in the book. In the film, it ends up going to him over a period of time, and then kind of becomes his little tame mouse. In the book as well, Paul goes to do some digging on John Coffey in records, In the film, he's given the transcript of why John Coffey is on death row, and then he goes digging with the lawyer that John Coffey had later on in the film. So we get the scene in both of the two girls going missing. Their dad and their brother running after them, amongst others joining in, and then seeing John Coffey sat there with the dead girls crying and saying that he tried to take it back but he couldn't. And we learn later what that means when he says he tried to take it back but couldn't. So in both, Paul has to talk to the warden because of Percy, who he sent off earlier and who he knows. But it's more of a talk than a reprimand because, again, everyone knows that Percy is a massive, pardon my language, tool. He is not a nice person. So he goes to the meeting in both, and we hear about the warden's wife for failing health and the migraines that she's having, and the fact that she's going to have to go to the doctor with it. Now, obviously, bear in mind this was like sort of like the 1930s. Obviously, nowadays, if someone, you know, has migraines that bad and the failing health, they'd go to the hospital straight away. But back then, it was more sort of like, oh, headaches are headaches. So in the film, the warden hints if Percy sees an execution, he will put in his papers to transfer. But in the book, he's openly saying that Percy needs to take part in the next execution because he's already seen an execution and he's not going to transfer until he takes part. So in the book now, we get sort of like a flashback to when the mouse arrives on E Block. But in the film, we see it happen in the current year that they are in. Everyone is amused by the mouse, apart from, of course, Percy. Percy vows that he's going to kill the mouse. And he kind of takes it a personal vendetta against him to kill this mouse. Now, we get the execution of Chief on E Block. And in the film, it's after John Coffey has arrived on death row, but in the book, it's before he arrives on death row. But in both, they do a trial of the execution before they actually do the execution. So they sort of walk it through and go, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do, this is how it happens. And it goes exactly the same in both film and book, and the execution goes smoothly, and he passes away. So now in the book, we get the arrival of Delacroix and Percy beating him within an inch of his life. On his arrival, but we never see this in the film. So as I said, in the film, already on E Block is the Chief and Delacroix, and then John Coffey comes and joins them. In the book, you have the Chief, who then gets executed, Delacroix, who's still there, and then John Coffey arrives. So as mentioned before, Delacroix gets a little box for the little mouse, Mr. Jingles, so he can stay with him. And, you know, I'd basically just look after him, really, and just keep him happy. So in both, obviously, Paul is suffering from a UTI, so he is in unbelievable pain. Now, I've never had one. I can't imagine they're nice. So, you know, he's trying to pee due to an infection. And Wharton was coming to E Block as well. So in both, we find out that the warden's wife has an inoperable brain tumour at this point, which obviously will then come up later in the book in this episode. So the arrival of Wharton. So Wharton is basically a crazy person who is a killer. He pretended to be insane and not with it, and then they realised that actually they're gonna execute him. So they moved him from the hospital to E Block, and as he's being picked up by Percy, Dean, and Harry. They assume he's drugged, so they don't do anything. They just leave him to it. They get him ready. They get to E Block. But once he gets to E Block, all hell breaks loose. And it's almost like Dean is knocked out. So he almost kills Dean, who's like the youngish lad, is knocked out by Brutus. And Percy is then shown at that point to be a coward. So with Paul's UTI as well getting worse at this point, John Coffey ends up using some sort of shine to heal Paul completely. So he takes Paul into the cell, he takes away the UTI, and basically Paul is fine then. He doesn't have to do anything, he's absolutely fine. So now in both, we have Paul heading out to find JC's lawyer. So in the film, he's a lawyer. In the book, he's a reporter. And he gets more information about Coffey because after this sort of like UTI incident, he realises that all might not be what it seems. It goes pretty much the same way though. The person that gives the information to Paul believes that Coffey is guilty without any doubt. So in both, Wharton is a huge problem. He ends up in restraints, he ends up in the padded room more than once, he ends up causing issues, he ends up spitting in people's faces, you know, trying to attack people. And at one point as well, he tries to like kill Percy, which kind of like Percy then wets himself. So when Paul sees as well, so Paul then goes off and sees the warden's wife in person and realizes that actually she's a lot worse than they thought. And he starts getting this idea about Coffee, about what he can do and maybe he can help her. So in both, Delacroix's execution comes around and Percy's put out front for it. So he's the one that's basically going to be killing Delacroix. Basically, he's in control. And part of that agreement is that he will then put in a transfer afterwards. So obviously Percy's at this point, he got, you know, taken by Wharton, he peed himself, Delacroix laughed at him, and that is the wrong thing to do. So before Delacroix is due to be executed, he has this really sweet thought about, you know, who's going to look after Mr. Jingles, how's it going to go? And they build up this really nice, like so Brutus and Paul relieve his fears by saying this is a little mouse circus, he's going to go away and live there and it'll be absolutely fine. And that's honestly so sweet. But so he's happy as anything. And then little Mr. Jingles runs across the floor. And what does Percy do? He stamps on him. Percy's a detestable human being. He gets everything that's coming to him. I'm telling you that now. So obviously Delacroix is absolutely heartbroken. Like Percy gets proper marched off the block. But so Mr. Jingles is, however, brought back to life by John Coffey, which is absolutely sweet. So he brings it back to life, and that just fills Delacroix with happiness. Even though he knows he's going to die, Mr. Jingles is going to be okay. So Brutus and Percy as well. Brutus and Paul, sorry, if push Percy around and let him know that they are not messing around. He goes after this execution. He goes. But Percy deliberately botches the execution of Delacroix and doesn't wet the sponge before he puts it on his head in the electric chair, which basically causes the most horrific death scene, where someone is being burned alive, essentially, from the inside out with electricity, and it is horrific. And it's an absolutely painful death. So it's around now that Paul truly understands as well what Coffey meant when he said that he tried to take it back with the girls, because he realises that he tried to take it back, which means that he tried to save the girls. So he's now 100% sure that Coffey is innocent, that it's definitely not him that killed the girls. But then he's not the only one. The other wardens as well are like, no, we 100%, not the other wardens, the other guards as well agree 100% that he is innocent. So then so Paul gets Dean and Harry and Brutus together around for lunch to discuss the plan to take Coffey to the warden's wife, so the warden's wife can be healed and be well again. They all agree on the plan because they all believe that Coffey is innocent and a sweet, sweet man. So the same night, they drug Wharton. They lock Percy in the restraint room and take Coffey over to the warden's house. As they're leaving, Wharton grabs Coffey's arm, and it seems to be almost painful with that small touch of Wharton grabbing Coffey's arm. And we'll find out later sort of why that is. So anyway, Coffey comes and saves the warden's wife, but cannot get rid of the bad stuff that's sucked out of her. So what happens is when he saves someone, he kind of like takes all this bad stuff into him, and then he needs to sort of like exhale it afterwards. But he doesn't do that. He keeps it inside himself. They successfully, however, get him back into prison. So they've broken him out. They've saved the warden's wife. They break him back in. They release Percy from the restraint room. And as he's stalking off, because he's going to cause issues with the rest of the people, Coffey grabs him and releases all that badness that he held in into Percy. So basically, Percy then turns around and shoots Wharton. And then he goes catatonic. And we never hear from Percy again. And I'm so happy. He deserved it. The horrible, horrible man. But then we find out that the reason that Coffey did that is because he knew that Percy was a bad man. But when Wharton touched Coffey's arm earlier, he learned that Wharton was the killer of the two girls. And he knew that he was just a horrible human being. So it's it's absolutely terrifying. Like it's horrible. So Paul then has a crisis of faith while talking to his wife because he knows Coffee's innocent, and yet he has to execute him all the same. And he wants to know with Coffee, what do I do? What do you want me to do? I'll break you out if you want me to break you out. But Coffee just wants it to end. So he is like, well, I've had enough, basically, of the nastiness and everything. So I just want it to end. So they don't. The execution is, oh my god, it's emotional and heartbreaking, and oh dear god. So it's literally like they don't put the hood over his face because he doesn't like the dark, and they all just stand there and watch him die, knowing that he is innocent. And oh my god, it gets me. It really gets me. And right after it's happened, most of the team, Harry, Dean, Brutus and Paul, put in for transfers elsewhere because they've had enough. So both the book and the film end with Paul showing Elaine, Mr. Jingles, who's still alive, and explaining in a way that they both had something transferred to them from Coffee, to the point that they're living very well past their years. Unfortunately, though, in the book there is a further bit where Elaine and Mr. Jingles pass away, whereas it's just Elaine that passes away in the film. We also do get a little bit at the end of the book as well about a horrible bus accident and how it killed Paul's wife quite horrifically. But apart from that, you know, the film is so incredibly close to the book. The timeline was a little crazy to start off with, like who comes in, who leaves and everything like that. And we do find out a lot more about those characters, who is loved and seen die over the years towards the end. But they have taken from this marvellous book and they've made such an emotional film, and they've done a really, really good adaptation of Stephen King, because I know it's hard to get. I've done a couple of book to film adaptations of Stephen King on this channel already, and he's such an esoteric writer sometimes that sometimes you cannot physically show what Stephen King is saying, because I don't think he even knows what it looks like. But they've done it with such care and consideration, and for how close it is, it gets an 8 out of 10 for plot. Now, obviously, this is my own opinion. I'm happy if you agree or disagree with anything that I say. Please leave it below in the comments, or do join in on the Facebook group on the Contented Narrative for discussions. If there's any books, film adaptations you'd like me to do, please just leave it below again in the comments. Don't forget to click subscribe as well, so you'll be alerted whenever a new video comes out. But until then, thank you so much, and always keep it contento.